Hello, I am Brian Borlick. I am the Director of Performance Research and National Technical Assistance and also Trade Adjustment Assistance at EDA. And thank you for joining us for our ARPA American Rescue Plan webinar on research and networks. Thank you for joining, and why don't we go ahead. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. I think you may have seen them before, but just in case, EDA is going to post the slides, some frequently asked questions, and then some other informational resources to the website after the webinar. And we also have this information up, including slides for our other ARPA programs. And while we're doing the webinar here, if you could be sure to enter any questions in the Q&A box and not the chat box. I'll be monitoring the Q&A box and I'm looking forward to that Q&A session. So I want to make sure you get them in the right place. So thank you. Let's see here. So $3 billion. EDA received an appropriation of $3 billion in American Rescue Plan funding, which recently, which the Secretary announced the programs under the American Rescue Plan recently. And this funding really allows EDA to lead what we hope will be a very transformational and unprecedented approach, given the size of the funding, for EDA. So we're really hoping for this to be a transformational program, certainly unprecedented. According to the language in the legislation, this is an approach to prevent, to prepare for, and to respond to coronavirus, and for the expenses for responding to economic injury as a result of the coronavirus. And there are two main kind of goals that we've designed these programs to accomplish. One is, with this level of funding, we're really hoping to speed up, to accelerate the economic recovery through these more transformational programs, to speed up the recovery from the pandemic, and then to build local economies that will be, that don't just build back, but this may sound familiar, don't just build back, but build back better, will be more resilient to future economic shocks. Move on. So in this $3 billion for American Rescue Plan, or ARPA funding, we have three main categories in terms of the programs that we will be administering. One is to help create jobs quickly, jobs for today, through our Good Jobs Challenge, through our travel, tourism, and outdoor recreation program, and Communities Built for All. And this is the case for all of our ARPA programs, but a very important component of this is equity in our implementation of ARPA, to ensure that we're serving traditionally underserved communities. Whether those be coal communities, underserved communities and populations, Native Americans, and so on and so forth. And actually, that's our top investment priority. We have created some fairly new investment priorities, which are on our website, eda.gov. I encourage you to check those out, and you'll see that the top one has to do with equity and ensuring that we are better serving underserved communities. Anyway, so that's not just for this one bucket, Communities Built for All, but I thought I'd mention it here. Under the Communities Built for All, Economic Adjustment Assistance, Indigenous Communities, and a Coal Communities Commitment. EDA is committed of the $3 billion, $300 million to support coal communities recovery from the pandemic. And under Regions for the Future, Build Back Better Regional Challenge, and then the Statewide Research and Networks. Now, the NOFO, or Notice of Funding Opportunity, that this refers to here is for statewide planning and research and networks. This particular webinar is focused on the research and networks part of that. We can move on to the next slide. The types of entities that are eligible for EDA funding: district organizations, our economic EDA designated and EDA funded economic development districts, which are organizations made up of both public and private sector participants that essentially develop and implement what we call CEDS or CEDS, Comprehensive Economic Development Strategies. Indian tribes, and this includes federally recognized Indian tribes and Alaska Native village or regional corporations. State and local governments or political subdivisions. That includes special purpose units of the state and local governments, those that are focused on economic or infrastructure development activities. And here are a few examples: airport commissions, regional development commissions, regional water sewer districts, institutes of higher education, universities, community colleges, which are becoming ever more important to ensuring that our businesses and that our industries have the skilled workers that they need to compete in the global economy. And then public or private nonprofit organizations or associations that are working in cooperation with these political subdivisions. Basically, that means a city or a town or a county. What that all kind of boils down to is that EDA is able to fund pretty much any entity except for a for-profit entity, for-profit company, or individual. Move on to the next slide. So I mentioned that this presentation is going to focus on the research and networks, or as we call them, communities of practice. I mentioned statewide planning. This is a program where we are providing funding to states, through the process of sending an invitation letter to the states to apply for and then receive these planning funds. And essentially what that's about is to help build statewide plans. So what does that mean? That means that there are multiple plans, as I'm sure you know, across a state, whether they be regional, like our comprehensive economic development strategies run by our economic development districts, or whether they be more local. The idea here is for the state with these funds to really develop a comprehensive plan for the state for recovery from the economic recovery from the pandemic that hopefully coordinates these disparate plans throughout the state. So what we're focused on here today, research, basically studying and evaluating our new programs. So what we don't want to do, of course, is to implement these programs, all 6 of these programs, and then at the end, just do an evaluation to see if it works. We want to make sure that we're monitoring and measuring as we go along so that we can possibly make adjustments as we go along to ensure that we're as effective and impactful as possible. So we call that ride-along research. And what we're talking about is, like, for example, once the grants are made, this very important goal of ensuring that we are serving underserved communities, this equity investment priority of ours and high priority of ours, that we are actually making progress there. And we don't wait until the end of a project to see if we did, but achieve that goal, but make sure and make any adjustments based on this research and these studies that we're funding along the way as we implement these programs after grants are made, to monitor and study and provide feedback to EDA and to our grantees based on what we learn through this type of research. Networks, or as we refer to them, communities of practice, that's really about formalizing a network of similar types of grantees to ensure that they're talking with each other, that they are networking, that they're sharing best practices, that they're not siloed and not learning from each other. We want to make sure that they're learning from each other along the way as these programs are implemented. And then also we would like them to be sustainable, to not end when the actual grant for the community of practice ends, but that they're sustainable and hopefully go on for a long time and build and grow and become formal networks of ARPA grantees, particularly in the good jobs program, in the Build Back Better, and then in the coal community. Those are particularly important, but we'd like to build them in potentially more within the ARPA programs. And then also, not just the ARPA programs, but other types of grantees that EDA makes grants to, for like university centers, or for economic development districts, Native American tribes, and several more. And those are listed on our webpage. Real quick about the grant rate of 100% for all three of these components. Grant rate, of course, meaning the percentage of the project costs that EDA can fund. So for all three of these components here, EDA can fund up to can fund 100%. Now, when there are matching funds that are being made available through in an application that shows that there are either matching funds and or in-kind contributions, all of which we refer to as the match, that this could, not guaranteed, but could make an application more competitive. And I think we'll talk about that just a little bit more in a minute. Okay, so I think now, why don't I go ahead and turn it over. I'm very happy to have a couple of important colleagues from the PRINTA, or Performance Research and National Technical Assistance Division at EDA. Bernadette Grafton and Akbar Naqvi are going to take it from here. So if I can turn it over to Bernadette, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Hey, everyone. So excited to see so many people on this webinar today. We're really excited to be sharing with you all of this information about both the research and the networks and communities of practice opportunities that are in the larger NOFO. I just wanted to start by giving you a bit of information about the timeline. As you know, the NOFO was published at the end of July, and we are now accepting applications on a rolling basis for both the research program and the networks and communities of practice program. While there is no hard deadline, we are strongly encouraging anyone who is interested to apply before October 31st of this year. The reason for this is to help ensure that we have research projects in place as soon as possible so that they can begin the work quickly and contribute to our understanding of economic recovery and response to the coronavirus pandemic. We also really just want to get these networks and communities of practice started early as possible so that they can begin to provide those critical resources and information sharing and technical assistance that will help accelerate economic recovery. Of course, we will still review and evaluate full applications received after October, but we will be accepting them on a rolling basis, so we'll be reviewing them and making decisions about them on a rolling basis, and all funds must be obligated by September of 2022. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the urgency that we have with these particular programs. And just as a note, when you're thinking about a potential project, all projects that are funded under this NOFO must have a period of performance end date that falls on or before May 31st of 2027 to allow for closeout. So that's just some brief information about the timeline. Before I get into some of the nitty-gritty of the evaluation criteria and expectations for an application, I want to turn it over now to Akbar to speak more about both of these programs in a little bit of more detail. Thanks, Akbar.
Sorry, just unmuting myself, but thanks, Bernadette, for that wonderful sort of introduction to everything. So I'm going to be talking to you guys about a bit more about the goals of both the research and the networks and communities of practice. Just if you don't know, my name's Akbar. I'm a economist within PRINTA. And so the research, and so both of these are actually pretty exciting for me specifically to observe how they turn out. But the way the research works is the EDA will support the development of tools, recommendations, and resources that shape federal economic development policies and inform economic development decision-making Awards under the research program will enhance our understanding and implementation of economic development concepts throughout the country. And EDA is interested specifically in like research projects that will help enable real-time research into EDA's American Rescue Plan Act programs, especially those related to the new Good Jobs Challenge, the Build Back Better Regional Challenge, Indigenous communities, and travel and tourism. And awards for research programs are expected to be between $200,000 and $600,000. And so what we're really looking for here is, most of all, sort of what we like to call ride-along research and evaluation into ARPA programs. You could fund multiple grantees under this, and ideally this would align with each of the programs. But we're basically trying to learn through doing. So it's not prospective necessarily. We want to continue sort of developing this over time. And we want to essentially monitor and collect data on and present data on some of our funding to EDA in general, and present the findings to the extent with which we are addressing the investment priorities, be it estimates from the applications when it comes to sort of the economic impacts of proposed applications. So we might get an estimate of jobs and private investment. We want to see if those estimates actually, something as simple as making sure those estimates are correct. Or we might want to look at the equity, another one of our investment priorities. And I'll go into more detail on that. But basically we want to, and another one is we want to help understand sort of the baseline conditions before the grant is awarded, and where the money is going and how it's being used. And we want to basically conduct necessary research to help EDA identify lessons from how programs are implemented or executed, as well as lessons about the structure of the funding of these programs. And again, the main goal here is to support, facilitate, and encourage learning in real time, because we are working with very new types of data. The research will involve collecting that data, learning best practices on how to collect it and how to better sort of evaluate. And along with that, we also want you to be able to use the data and find some interesting information of it. So basically, the components of a research project might include progress towards meeting the goals of the programs, progress towards meeting estimates of applications, collecting and analyzing expected outcomes or impacts of projects and monitoring progress, observing, reflecting on, and identifying emerging issues or promising practices. And as projects mature near the end of the award period, we would also be interested in looking at program outputs and impacts if it makes sense at the time. We expect that all that data will be made available publicly. And we also expect collaboration and coordination with other research grantees to make sure that, again, the data is available publicly and there's no information silos, as they call it, and their sort of priorities are aligned. And I know you guys have, I'm sure you've been wondering about examples of the kinds of research projects that we would be looking for. Keep in mind that the ones that I'm describing are not necessarily the ones we would expect from ARPA. They could be, they could not be, but these are just the kinds of examples that we decided to bring up when thinking of what we think as EDA think of as an economic development research project. So a current RNTA project we're doing, Research and National Technical Assistance Division works on it. It's called the Research on Nuclear Closure Communities, which seeks to identify the baseline conditions to understand what communities look like before any treatment is applied, and basically observe communities throughout to understand the impact and outcomes of this funding. And this is, this will be sort of analogous to how we would expect research grants to be evaluated specifically for coal communities and the sort of investments in the American Rescue Plan Act that go towards them. They deal with sort of different issues, but the general process we would expect to be a bit similar to that. Another particular example is specifically for the Build Back Better Regional Challenge. What can we learn about those grantees that received phase 1 of the grants, of those that received phase 1 and not phase 2, and of those who received both phase 1 and phase 2? So looking at the different sort of conditions and economic conditions and sort of the way the funding was monitored, for those 3 different groups is one way we could look at through that. Another way, which is really important, in my opinion, at least it's important to me as somebody who's studied this topic, is sort of the strong theoretical foundations of this Build Back Better regional challenge, which is based on the idea of what we like to call clusters, industrial clusters, and there's a lot of research on it. And EDA is really sort of trying to put this into practice. So sort of a practical, real-world experiment, being able to find ways to monitor that and collect data on that to sort of inform the general economic development stakeholder audience, and just sort of contribute to the general knowledge of the topic, and just sort of help everyone in that aspect. And another one is coal community. Again, like I said, coal community investments are going to be particularly important. And any research on coal community investments must be real time and not broad historical impact research. So if a coal community applies for EDA funding, did they get the award? What happens to their capacity if they get the award? What happens to their capacity if they don't get the award? What are the economic conditions in coal communities or areas adjacent to them? Have they diversified? What is the distress? And it would likely be based on a concept of a cohort. And finally, another very important example, because it's our most important investment priority, is equity investments. So basically determining if applicants meet EDA's equity criteria and if the project worked towards meeting specific goals. And the way I would think of this is, if we expect some of this funding to, say, through jobs, private investment, and all the other sort of great things that we expect this money to do, if it increases the size of the pie for these communities, is that pie being distributed equitably? Equitably, whether it's across geography, across race. These are sort of what we value in terms of equity. It's not just about, sort of increasing the prosperity of the region, even though it's really important. It's about, is the prosperity being shared equitably? So that's a lot, and I'm on research, and next I'll be moving on to talking about the communities of practice, and what that seems to do is sort of kind of connect all these EDA grantees from the identified groups of stakeholders with others of the same group, or possibly also across multiple groups to provide those cohorts technical assistance. So this includes ARPA grantees, Build Back Better Regional Challenge grantees, Good Jobs Challenge, coal communities, but it's not just ARPA grantees. It can also be other stakeholder groups for which EDA has already established communities and networks, because we expect you all to leverage sort of existing relationships, as that makes these communities of practice stronger. So EDDs, tribal partners, university centers, RLFs / revolving loan funds, build-to-scale grantees, and other cross-cutting stakeholder groups. EDA supports regional economic development, and there are many types of groups that are potentially critical to regional economic development ecosystems. And to the extent that there are additional stakeholder groups not identified above, such as economic development organizations or persistent poverty counties, that are significant in number and critical to the healthy economic development ecosystems, EDA will also consider applications that seek to support those other networks of communities of practice. However, the applicant organization must connect their mission and their community of stakeholders to the foundational economic development principles to demonstrate their level of importance to regional economic development ecosystems. And the Community of Practice Challenge seeks applications to build, launch, and operate a nationwide network supporting one or more of the above-mentioned cohorts, designed to establish and strengthen communication and collaboration between groups from the cohort, including building urban-rural linkages, develop, organize, disseminate best practices, and essentially we want you all to leverage the relationships among each other, and work towards further best practices. And an important reminder to this is more than sort of a series of webinars and one-pagers. We expect this to be a network of sustainable in-person gatherings where possible, as well as virtual gatherings, and sharing of, again, best practices and tips around pandemic recovery, specifically economic recovery, learning from each other. And the activities should be documented for ongoing learning and engagement, and they should be action-oriented and working towards concrete outcomes. That was a lot of information. but it's a lot. We're expecting a lot from these grants, and these grants are very broad in scope. So I want to turn it back over to Bernadette to talk a bit more about the process of everything. So thank you.
Thank you, Akbar. Really appreciate all of that information. I'm sure everyone is trying to absorb all of it right now. But I just wanted to pause while you're trying to think through that and just really encourage you, if you're thinking about applying to either the research or the networks and communities of practice portion of the NOFO, that you think big and that you think broad with it. As Akbar mentioned, we're not trying to be prescriptive. There are some structures and some boundaries that are outlined very clearly in the NOFO, but we would really be looking for anything that you think could be of value to the economic development ecosystem and recovery from the pandemic. So please think big, think broad, be bold in your proposals if you are interested in applying. So applications, let's get down to the details of what I'm sure many of you are interested in hearing about. The applications must include materials that are listed in the NOFO. It's section D2A. It's all outlined there. All applications must include all of those components to be considered for funding. EDA will review applications as quickly as we can after we receive them, but if it's not a complete application, it will not be reviewed. The NOFO, as I said, is very specific about everything that is required. There are checklists in there, so read through that very carefully. And all projects that are applying for funding should really articulate very clearly and have a logical nexus to how that particular project is going to support EDA's investment priorities and the specific programmatic funding priorities that are, again, listed in the NOFO. You need to tell us all of that for us to really get an understanding of the goals of the project. The application must clearly articulate the overall goals of the project as well, the specific and distinct scope of work and the concrete activities that will be accomplished under that particular project. Also, I know this seems small and simple, but you really need to identify if you're applying for the research or the networks and communities of practice program, because there are distinct criteria within each of those that are laid out within the NOFO. There's very specific questions and points that need to be responded to depending on which program you're seeking funding for. Again, you need to adhere to the requirements in the NOFO when it comes to word and page limits. Those are specified in each section of that part of the application, and pages that are beyond the specified page limit for that will not be considered or even read. So if it's a 10-page word limit or a 10-page limit on that particular section, we will not read page 11 if you've submitted 11 pages. So keep that in mind when you're preparing your application. As I said, there are sub-criteria laid out in the NOFO for both the research component and the networks and communities of practice component. So pay attention to those when you're developing your application. There are some general criteria that apply to both, and I will be going through those now. So each application will be evaluated on the applicant's capacity, the applicant's expertise in the applicable component, the strategic approach of that particular project, the feasibility of the budget, as well as the strength of the proposed financial match, if any, the feasibility of the deliverables and the timeline, the project sustainability, scalability, and dissemination, and then cross-collaboration with other EDA grantees and or other economic development partners. I want to go back to applicant capacity and expertise quickly. We're not looking for a resume response here. We're looking for you to justify your capacity to manage a federal award, as well as your relevant expertise in that particular subject area. Why are you particularly qualified to carry out that scope of work? You got to lay that out for us within each of those components. Going back to the budget and the financial match quickly, earlier, Brian had mentioned that there is 100% funding, 100% grant rate for these programs. And while match is required, it may not guarantee any preference, but it is helpful. So if you are able to provide any financial match along with your award, it could help your competitiveness, but it is not guaranteed. I just want to make sure that that is very clear, because we are looking at all of the evaluation criteria as a whole. So keep that in mind as well regarding matching funds. We know it can be difficult to obtain them, and it may not always make sense, which is why this is 100% grant rate. Again, all applications are encouraged to be submitted by October 31st of 2021. All right, so what are the next steps? So you're here in this webinar. That's great. That's the first step. We're glad you're here. If you missed part of the webinar, we would encourage you to go back once it's been posted on EDA's website under the ARPA resources. We would encourage you to go back and listen to the beginning. There's been a lot of really helpful information shared in the webinar today, and I'm sure that if you missed the earlier portions and you've been asking questions, your answer was probably given earlier on. But I would encourage you to watch the webinar if you missed part of it, tell other people about this opportunity, read the NOFO and the eligibility requirements. It's on grants.gov. The full PDF is listed there. We've done our best to make sure it is extremely clear and transparent what our expectations are. So please read the NOFO. If you have any questions after doing all of those things, we have some email addresses here that you can reach out to for each of the 3 programs identified in the NOFO. Remember, the first one was the statewide planning. If you have any questions, reach out to your economic development representative or your EDA regional office for that. If you have questions about the research program, the email inbox is the research@eda.gov. And if you have questions about the networks and communities of practice program, reach out to networks@eda.gov. We'd be happy to answer any questions you have. If you wanted to kind of check to see if your particular idea is of interest or could potentially be duplicative of another project, we are happy to provide whatever information that we're able to within the confines of the NOFO, of course, because it is an open competition. So those are all of the things that I had to share with you today. I can now turn it back over to our moderators and other panelists for next steps.
Thank you very much, Bernadette, and thank you very much, Akbar. I know that we've had our friend Ryan Smith, I think, monitoring questions, and maybe a couple other of our colleagues. So I'm sure there's some good questions. Let's see if we can provide some good answers.
Great. Yeah, this is Ryan Smith. I'm the Research and National Technical Assistance Coordinator for EDA. I've been monitoring the chat box just so everybody knows that this presentation is going to be provided on EDA's website. There will be a spot within the ARPA materials that will focus on this webinar, the previous webinars, and all of the content that's being generated over the last week and into next week for each of these different NOFOs. We will be making sure that that gets publicly posted so that you can all go back to that and take a look at it. There's one question that I really wanted to get to that asks about the U.S. cluster mapping tool, and that turns out to be a really important project for this conversation, for Build Back Better, for all of the ARPA programming, both because it's a great example of a research project. It took several years, and it's a very useful tool. I think it's a great example of what EDA can do through its research programming and really help to identify regional clusters and how your regional ecosystems can support those clusters, engage with different clusters, and really understand the way that that kind of economic development takes place. So I think that that's a really good example. It's not the only example, but you could take a look at EDA's RNTA tools and RNTA economic development tools within its website and you can get a good sense of some of the other things that EDA has done, some of the work that from data tools, publicly available data sets, things like that, but also the National Technical Assistance Program itself. That was one question that I saw. Brian, did you have any content that you wanted to share on that? I know that you were around when that project was being developed.
I think you've done a great job, Brian. I would note that, yeah, it was a 4-year project with Harvard Business School. And yeah, it provides, I mean, first of all, a map of where the industry clusters across the country are. I think one of its neatest functions is within an industry cluster, you're able to look at what the networks are, you know, supply chain networks, what other clusters build into those. That's very helpful as you think about, you know, potentially diversifying an economy or strengthening an industry cluster. So yeah, I would encourage you to check it out.
Thanks, Brian. Great project. Another good question that came up talks a little bit about the cooperation requirement, which is that the requirement for an applicant to be acting in cooperation with officials of a general purpose political subdivision of the state. This is a really good question. I am not sure that everybody exactly knows what that means. But what I think boiling it down means that if a research group, a university, a non-governmental organization, a think tank, a consortium of those eligible entities, if they want to be doing research on a particular piece of the Build Back Better programming, we would be looking to have them just provide that research. They wouldn't necessarily have to have a relationship with, you know, any of the, you know, subdivisions, that political subdivision, whether it's a town or a county or a state level government. I think what we're looking for here is real meaningful, authentic engagement with each of these communities of applicants and the communities of practice across these ecosystems. That's a good question. Bernadette or Jason, are there any other things that you have seen sort of pop up that you want to try to address within those questions?
This is Shelby. I have a question that I've seen a lot. Can organizations apply to both programs or multiple programs under the American Rescue Plan funding?
So yes, they can. We would, what we would not want to see is the same project being applied for in multiple programs. But you can certainly apply for different types of projects in the different programs through the different NOFOs.
Maria or Shelby, was there anything else that sort of came through? I'm seeing a lot of really similar questions around where the materials are going to be and eligible applicants and things like that. I think, you know, we really have to refer you back to the NOFO. I think in general, it's important for folks to pay really close attention to how they're incorporated and what the legal requirements are for this funding. But the best place to look at that is directly in the NOFO.
I see a question. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I saw a question about first-time applicants and how an applicant would describe their capacity to manage a federal award. That is an excellent question. And what we're really looking for there is, do you have the structures in place to manage a federal award? Do you know where to access the resources for managing a federal award? And a lot of this, one of the pieces of that question was a finance team. That is a significant part of it. Do you have somebody who's familiar with financials and reimbursements and that kind of documentation? It's for first-time applicants, it can be really helpful to reach out to a current EDA grantee, maybe to talk to them about their experience in managing a federal award. and then to see if you have any related experience that you could describe then in your application. So that would be my recommendation for you on that one.
One question that I noticed a lot in the chat was, what does a community of practice need to cover in terms of the size of the region or the types of people that it should be connecting? I don't know if you all want to provide a high-level answer to that.
Well, I guess what I would say is the expectation and the goal would be, take, for example, a community of practice for revolving loan funds, EDA's revolving loan funds, and there are hundreds of those across the country. So we would be looking for, of course, the grantee for this community of practice. We would, of course, share who those RLFs are, although that's already available on EDA's website. If you look at resources, the resources tab on EDA's website, you'll see a list of economic development resources, including some at the state level, but then mostly with EDA funds, including the economic development districts and the revolving loan funds. So we would be looking to the grantee to, shoot for 100% participation by all of those grantees if possible, but certainly as close as we can. So that would be a nationwide network of the grantees, or as we call them, RLF operators, as many of them as possible. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Brian. I'll follow up. One question asked, if I applied as a community of practice for all EAA programs, but just directed towards governments, would that be allowable?
Not sure if I 100% follow, directed just towards government. So we're talking about grantees, some of which may be governments, if that's what we mean. We probably would not be looking, if I understand the question, that the focus of that community of practice would be just governments. That may be less competitive in that we're looking for, say, as many of the participating organizations and people in, say, the Good Jobs Challenge, which would include governments, but also other stakeholders. The purpose is really to convene all of the stakeholders, all the participants in the program, not just one type. We are open to ideas. I'm not trying to shoot anything down whatsoever. We're looking for clever ideas. That's just my first reaction to that question.
Yeah, I think Brian, we're trying to walk a fairly fine line here, which is that we want the space to be creative, right? We want people to swing big. We want people to really be creative about how to approach this, and so we're seeing a lot of things in the chat related to, does my community of practice need to serve a neighborhood or a state or nationwide? I think it depends on the programming. It really depends on what it is that you're trying to influence and what it is that you're trying to learn from. It's not just to have a community of practice. It's to get people engaging and bumping into each other with ideas and really scaling this work. And so I think if you are looking at a network of practice of, EDA applicants within a county, that's a pretty small community of practice. But if you're looking at all of the applicants or all of the potential awardees under a national competition, that's starting to look a little bit more at scale what I think it would need to be. But it's not restricted to that. If you can make that case, and if you can make that competitive case around, there's a very important group of stakeholders that is in a small geography, but they need to work together, I think that there is the possibility that works. Somebody put in the chat
I agree with that, Ryan, 100%. I do want to make clear as far as, expectations. We really are looking for nationwide networks, but what Ryan says rings true. But just want to make clear that we're looking for nationwide networks, unless, some very compelling idea comes along that's not a nationwide network. I don't know if Ryan's on mute. It could just be my computer.
I'm not hearing him either.
It's me. I
There
I'm
you
on
go.
mute. Sorry. Yeah. So I think that this has been a great conversation, and hopefully you all have taken away some really good content on this. I think we'll continue to get some questions that come in through the email boxes, but I think we're probably getting pretty close to wrapping up, in case anybody else has any final thoughts.
Yeah, there's one thing that keeps coming up, and it's regarding matching requirements. So I think I want to clarify that again for those who either missed it or still had some outstanding questions. So there is a 100% grant rate for all of these programs, meaning match is not required. You do not have to bring any match to the table in your application. That doesn't mean you can't. You certainly could, and we would welcome match if you're able to. It may make an application more competitive, but it also may not if the rest of your application isn't competitive. We're looking at, as you'll see in the NOFO, there's a number of evaluation criteria, and it's out of a total of 100 points. And if you don't do well in one particular evaluation criteria or a few, but you have a lot of match, that still may not make your application more competitive if you didn't do well in the other components. So it's not that match could elevate you above the rest, but it could help, especially if there are two applications who scored excellently or who scored very well in all of the other evaluation criteria, and one brings match to the table and the other doesn't. We may consider that in our decision making. That's what we meant to say by the match. Hopefully that helps to clarify things. I know there were some concerns expressed in the chat.
Thanks a lot, Bernadette. I think on that note, I think we're probably ready to wrap up. And thanks for everybody joining us today. Hopefully you've got some good ideas percolating, and we're ready to receive. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
We appreciate your interest in the program. Thank you.